The paper shook in Edna Atwood's hands, and not from the dry October wind that whipped through the open doorway of the Sweetwater land office. She read the clause a second time, then a third, her dark eyes moving across the handwritten lines with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what words were capable of, how they could wound, how they could rob, how they could bury a person alive under the weight of their own signature. The blood drained from her face. Then it rushed back in a wave of fury, so hot she could feel it in her fingertips. Patrick Turner stood 3 feet away, broad-shouldered and implacable as a canyon wall, his sun-darkened arms folded across his chest, his jaw set in that infuriating expression of absolute certainty that she had come to know and loathe over the past 2 months. He was already smiling, not a kind smile, the smile of a man who believed he had already won. "Take your time," he said. The words were generous. The tone was not. Edna set the contract down on the scarred oak desk with a deliberateness that cost her everything she had. She pressed her palm flat against the paper and looked up at him. The land office clerk, a nervous young man named Mr. Aldous Finch, stood behind the desk with his pen hovering over his inkwell, clearly wishing he were anywhere else in the state of Wyoming. "Section 7, Edna said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Paragraph 3, Subclause C." Patrick's smile did not waver. "What about it? You know what about it?" "Miss Atwood," he said, with the patient condescension of a man explaining arithmetic to a child, "that clause simply protects the mineral rights in the event that the primary party fails to maintain continuous occupation of the northern quarter section for a period exceeding 90 days, Edna said, "which begins on the date of initial signing, which was August the 3rd. She picked up the contract again and held it out toward him, turned to the second page, her finger resting beneath a line of text that she had spotted 3 minutes ago and that had changed everything. "And today is November the 1st. The smile flickered. "The school," Edna continued, her voice still that terrible controlled calm, "closes for the winter recess on November the 5th, 4 days from now. I would be absent from the property for a minimum of 6 weeks while I returned to Cheyenne to collect my sister and her children as we discussed. 6 weeks, which would have put me past the 90-day window." She set the paper back down. "Which would have voided my claim to the northern pasture entirely, which would have handed it to you, since as the adjacent landholder you are named as the default beneficiary in the event of an occupancy lapse." She looked at him directly. "Tell me I am wrong." The room was very quiet. The wind outside had stopped as if it too was waiting. Patrick Turner uncrossed his arms slowly. The certainty in his expression did not crumble all at once. It eroded, like riverbank clay under a steady current, a little at a time, until what was left beneath it was something raw and exposed and impossible to name. He had not expected this. That much was written plainly across every hard line of his face. And Edna Atwood, schoolteacher, landowner, and the single most infuriating woman Patrick Turner had ever encountered in 34 years of living, allowed herself exactly 1 second of cold satisfaction before the anger came back, cleaner and sharper than before. Because this was not a mistake in the contract. She understood that now with perfect clarity. This was a trap. Carefully constructed, buried in the language of legality, designed to look like standard boilerplate, and timed with surgical precision to coincide with her most predictable absence. Someone had built this. And the man standing 3 feet away from her, with his exposed jaw and his unraveling composure, was the only person who stood to benefit from it. She had come to Sweetwater, Wyoming in the spring of 1882 with $37, a crate of books, a determination that people in town had variously described as admirable, unsettling, and occasionally exhausting, and a land deed that her father had left her when he died of fever the previous winter. Josiah Atwood had filed the claim in 1879, 3 years before his death, on a quarter section of Wyoming grassland that sat between the Sweetwater River and a long ridge of cottonwood trees that turned gold in the autumn and looked, on a clear morning like something out of a painting that had never been painted because no painter had yet been brave enough to try. The land was not much, not by the standards of the men who ran cattle empires through this part of Wyoming, but it was hers. Her father had meant it for her, had told her so in the letter he left with the deed, had written in his careful schoolmaster's hand, because Josiah Atwood had been a schoolteacher too, and Edna had inherited everything from him, that the land was a foundation, not a destination but a place to build from. And Edna, who had spent the 12 years since her mother's death building herself into something solid and self-sufficient in a world that preferred its women decorative and dependent, understood exactly what he meant. She had arrived in Sweetwater in April, introduced herself to the school board, taken up her position at the one-room schoolhouse on Birch Creek Road, and ridden out to inspect her land on a borrowed horse the following Saturday morning. She had stood in the middle of the north pasture with the spring wind in her hair and the grass green and alive around her ankles, and felt something shift in her chest, some tight and long-held thing releasing, like a fist finally opening. That was when Patrick Turner had appeared on the ridge above her. He was on horseback, a big gray gelding, and even at that distance she could see the breadth of his shoulders and the easy confidence with which he sat a horse, the kind of ease that comes not from arrogance but from years of belonging to the land. He had a hat pulled low, and he sat there for a moment looking down at her in the north pasture with an expression she could not read at that distance. Then he rode down. "You're on Turner land," he said. "I'm on Atwood land," she said. Deed number 4721 filed with the Wyoming Territorial Land Office, March of 1879. Would you like to see a copy? He had looked at her with those dark green eyes, the color of the river in shadow, and she had looked back, and something had crackled between them like the air before a lightning storm. Not hostility exactly, something more complicated and considerably more inconvenient than simple hostility. "Patrick Turner," he said, and held his hand down from the horse. "Edna Atwood," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely businesslike. So was hers. "The north pasture shares a fence line with my east boundary," he said. "I know," she said. "I have a map." He looked at her a moment longer. "You planning to run cattle?" "I'm planning to teach school," she said. "In town. The land is for my family eventually. My father left it to me." Something crossed his face then, not softness exactly, but a recognition of grief or the memory of it. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "Thank you," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and rode back up the ridge, and Edna watched him go and told herself the ache behind her breastbone was nothing more than the cold spring wind. She had been wrong, of course, but she did not know that yet. The town of Sweetwater in 1882 was not a small town by frontier standards. It had a general store, a post office, a land office, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a telegraph office that had been operational for 3 years, and that the townspeople still regarded with a mixture of wonder and suspicion, and the schoolhouse on Birch Creek Road where Edna Atwood arrived every morning at 7:30, built the fire in the iron stove, wrote the day's lessons on the slate board in her precise and beautiful hand, and proceeded to teach 22 children between the ages of 6 and 14 the arithmetic, reading, writing, history, and elementary science that Wyoming Territory required, and that Edna Atwood was constitutionally incapable of delivering with anything less than complete dedication. She was 28 years old. She had attended the Cheyenne Female Seminary, where she had studied for 4 years and graduated at the top of her class with a particular distinction in mathematics and contract law, which she had studied independently, because the seminary did not offer it formally, but had a library that did not lock its doors. And Edna had always had a particular relationship with libraries and locked doors, which was to say, she did not recognize the authority of either. She had taught school in Cheyenne for 3 years before her father's death, and the subsequent inheritance had brought her north to Sweetwater. She was also, though she would have been the last person in Sweetwater to say so, very nearly beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness. She had strong features, a decisive jaw, dark eyes that missed very little, a mouth that was generous when she was happy and precise as a blade when she was not, and a way of moving through the world that suggested she had decided long ago exactly how much space she was entitled to occupy, and had never permitted anyone to talk her out of it. The women of Sweetwater liked her immediately and without reservation, which surprised her pleasantly. The men of Sweetwater were divided, which did not surprise her at all. Patrick Turner, from what she could gather in her first weeks in town, was generally regarded as the most important man in the valley. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county, the Turner Ranch, which his father had built on 300 acres of Wyoming grassland in the 1860s, and which Patrick had expanded to nearly 900 acres in the 15 years since his father's death. He was respected in the way that men of consequence are respected in frontier towns, with a combination of genuine admiration and careful distance. He paid his hands fair wages, kept his fences maintained, attended church without ostentation, and had served 2 terms on the county land commission, which was how he knew every filing, every deed, and every contract that had passed through the Sweetwater land office in the past 8 years. He had also, in the 3 years since his wife had died of childbed fever, along with the infant boy who had not survived the birth, built around himself a quiet and absolute solitude that the town respected too much to intrude upon. Women had tried. Women had been gently and definitively discouraged. Patrick Turner, Sweetwater agreed, was a man who had loved once and buried it and was not looking to unbury it. What Sweetwater did not account for was Edna Atwood. It started slowly, the way the most significant things always do, disguised as something ordinary. The first time Patrick came to the schoolhouse, it was on official business. He was on the land commission, and there was a boundary survey being conducted along Birch Creek Road that required him to measure the road frontage adjacent to the school property. He came on a Tuesday morning in early May, knocked on the schoolhouse door, and explained his business to Edna in the same brisk and businesslike tone she had come to expect from him. She had 22 children in the room, deep in their morning arithmetic, and she stepped outside with him for the space of 2 minutes to look at the survey map he had brought. He unrolled it on the hitching post, and she looked at it and pointed immediately to a discrepancy in the eastern boundary marker that he had missed. He looked at where she was pointing, then he looked at her. "How did you see that?" he said. "The scale is wrong," she said. "Here." She took the pencil from behind his ear without asking permission. She registered the small shock of contact when her fingers brushed his temple and catalogued it clinically and moved on and drew a small corrective notation on the margin of the map. The marker as drawn puts the road frontage at 42 feet. The actual measurement listed in the text is 47. Someone made an error in the drafting. Patrick studied the map for a long moment. "The survey was done by Harold Bright," he said. "He's been doing county surveys for 10 years. Then he has been making this particular error for 10 years, Edna said pleasantly, and went back inside to her students. She did not think about it again. She had a classroom to run. Patrick Turner thought about it for considerably longer. He came back the following week, not on official business. He brought a book, a mathematics primer he had found at the general store. He said that he thought the school might be able to use. Edna accepted the book, thanked him, and noticed that it was an algebra text well above the level of any student she currently had. She did not say so. She put it on the shelf with the others and said she was sure it would be useful someday. The week after that he stopped by to ask about the Birch Creek water rights, which he said were under review by the commission and which abutted the school property. She walked the creek line with him on a Saturday morning while the schoolhouse sat empty, and she pointed out 3 things along the bank that he had not noticed, including a secondary channel that would affect the water rights calculation significantly, and a collapsed marker post that someone had reset in the wrong position, apparently some years ago. He stopped walking and looked at her. "Miss Atwood," he said, "Where did you study land law?" "I did not study land law," she said. "I studied mathematics and read extensively." "Land surveys are applied geometry, Mr. Turner. The principles are consistent." "Most people can't read a survey map at all," he said. "Most people are not paying attention," she said. He was quiet for a moment. They were standing beside the creek, the water running clear and quick over the smooth stones, the cottonwood trees already putting out their first pale leaves. The morning was cool and smelled of wet earth and grass, and something clean and new that she associated entirely with Wyoming and had no name for. "You are not most people," Patrick Turner said. It was a simple statement, declarative, entirely without the condescension or the careful management of female capability that she had learned to expect from men who said similar things. He said it the way he might say the creek runs north or the fence needs mending, as a fact, observed and acknowledged. Edna felt something warm move through her chest and took a careful step back from it. "No," she agreed. "I am not." May became June. June became July. The summer was relentless and brilliant. The Wyoming sky enormous and cloudless above the valley, the grassland gold and shimmering in the heat. Edna taught school through the end of June, then spent July working her land with her own hands, which created considerable discussion in Sweetwater, but which she found deeply satisfying. She had hired 2 men from the labor pool at the general store, honest men. She judged them, a Mexican cowhand named Esteban and an older homesteader named Carr who had lost his own place to debt and needed the work. And together they repaired the fence line along the north pasture, cleared the collapsed outbuilding, and began laying the foundation for a proper homestead structure. She sweated and blistered and ached and slept the sleep of the absolutely exhausted, and she had never in her life been more herself than she was that summer. Patrick Turner rode by the north pasture 3 times in those weeks. Each time he stopped at the fence line and watched for a moment her, with her leather gloves and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, driving posts with a maul that was nearly as long as she was tall, and each time he rode on without stopping. But the 3rd time she looked up and caught his eye across the fence, and he did not look away immediately. And what passed between them in that moment before he tipped his hat and rode on was something that neither of them was yet prepared to name. The complication arrived in August, wearing the face of a man named Roland Greer. Greer was a land speculator out of Denver, which was to say he was a man who dealt in other people's property the way a card sharp dealt in other people's money, with great expertise and absolutely without scruple. He had arrived in Sweetwater in July, established himself at the better of the 2 saloons, and had spent 3 weeks moving through the valley identifying land holdings whose owners might be susceptible to pressure, persuasion, or simple predation. He wanted Edna's north pasture. Specifically, he wanted the mineral rights beneath it, because someone, a geologist passing through Sweetwater 2 years earlier, had mentioned in passing that the rock formation along the North Ridge bore certain characteristics that were not inconsistent with the presence of coal deposits. It was not confirmed. It was not even close to confirmed. But Roland Greer had made his fortune on the distance between not confirmed and confirmed, and he was very good at bridging it with other people's land. He approached Edna directly, which she gave him credit for. He made her an offer for the north pasture. She declined. He raised the offer. She declined again. He made various suggestions about the difficulty a single woman would have maintaining a land claim through the Wyoming winter, and she looked at him with a calm so absolute that he actually took a step backward. "I am not for sale, Mr. Greer," she said. "Neither is my land. Good day." He went away. She thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. What she did not know, what she would not discover until the day she stood in the land office with the contract shaking in her hands, was that Roland Greer had gone next to the Turner Ranch. She did not know what was said at that meeting. She did not know whether it was money that changed hands or promises or simply the shared understanding of men who calculated everything in terms of advantage. What she knew, what the contract told her with devastating clarity, was that someone with detailed knowledge of her land claim, her teaching schedule, her planned winter travel, and the specific language of Wyoming territorial land law had built a hidden clause into a fencing easement agreement that she had signed in August. The fencing easement had seemed legitimate at the time. A straightforward matter. Patrick Turner needed to run a fence line across the corner of her north pasture to comply with a county ordinance about livestock containment near the road. She had agreed, and the agreement had required her signature on a 3-page document that her principal error, her one and catastrophic error, had been to read carefully but not completely. She had focused on the easement terms, which were in order. She had not turned to the 3rd page, where someone had inserted a standard-looking subclause about continuous occupancy in language so routine that it might have come from any boilerplate template. But it had not come from a template. It had been written specifically for her, specifically for the 90-day window that would align with her winter travel, specifically for the purpose of handing her north pasture to the adjacent landholder, Patrick Turner, by the mechanism of her own signature. She stood in the land office on November the 1st and looked at Patrick Turner and tried to find in his face the man who had said, "You are not most people," with the honesty of someone stating a fact. And she tried to reconcile that man with the one who had apparently spent the summer constructing a legal trap to steal her land, and the effort of reconciliation produced something in her chest that was worse than anger. It was grief. "Did you know?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was furiously proud of how steady her voice was. Patrick did not answer immediately. He was still looking at the contract, his jaw working, his hands loose at his sides. Something was happening in him that she could not entirely read, and she hated that she could not read it because she had always been able to read things. "Did you know about this clause?" she asked again. "Miss Atwood, it is a simple question, Mr. Turner. Yes or no?" "No," he said. The word came out hard and flat and without the softening that a lie usually carried with it. But Edna Atwood had not survived 28 years in a world full of men who believed their words automatically, to have learned to trust a flat denial. "The default beneficiary of the occupancy clause is the adjacent landholder," she said. "I can read," he said, and now there was something in his voice that was not guilt but was very close to something she could not name, something dark and stirred up. "Then you understand why I am asking?" "Yes," he said. "I understand why you are asking." He pulled a chair out from beside the desk and sat down heavily, which surprised her, because Patrick Turner was not a man who sat heavily. He was a man who moved with a deliberate economy that never wasted itself on unnecessary display of feeling. And the answer is still no. I did not know that clause was in there. Mr. Aldous Finch behind the desk was doing a remarkable impression of a man who had become part of the furniture. "Who prepared the contract?" Edna asked, turning to him. Finch cleared his throat. "It was, the original draft was brought in by Mr." He stopped. He looked at Patrick, he looked at Edna, he looked at his inkwell with the expression of a man who wished he could drown in it. "Who?" Edna said. "Mr. Greer," Finch said. "Mr. Roland Greer prepared the initial draft. He submitted it to the commission for review in late July. Mr. Turner reviewed and signed the commission approval. The final version that was presented to you for signature in August was there may have been some modifications made to the final version after the commission review." Patrick Turner's head came up sharply. "Greer," he said. The single word had the sound of something heavy falling. "He was in town in July," Edna said. She was watching Patrick very carefully now, recalibrating, running every calculation she had at her disposal. "He approached me about purchasing the north pasture. I refused him." "He approached me too," Patrick said, and now his voice had shifted into something quieter and more dangerous. "He wanted to purchase mineral rights options across several properties in the valley. I told him no as well." He stood up from the chair. "Finch, are you telling me Greer submitted a modified version of the contract after I signed the commission approval?" That is, the document that came to me for filing was Mr. Turner. I received it through the normal process, and I did not compare it to the commission-approved version line by line. Where is Greer now? Patrick asked. He left Sweetwater, Finch said miserably. About 6 weeks ago. He rode south, I don't know where. The room was quiet again, but differently quiet now. The quality of the silence had changed. Edna looked at the contract. She looked at Patrick Turner. She looked at the place where her understanding of events had been, and she looked at the new shape that was forming in that place, which was different from the shape she had assumed when she first read Subclause C. And she did not rush the looking because she had learned a very long time ago that the cost of a wrong conclusion is always higher than the time it takes to reach a right one. If Greer modified the contract after your commission approval, she said slowly, then the occupancy clause is fraudulent. It was never legitimately reviewed. Yes, Patrick said. He was looking at her steadily. The green eyes were very direct. Whatever he was feeling was happening somewhere deep, and he was not going to show it to her yet, and she recognized that because she was doing the same thing. That is correct. Which means the clause is legally void. Which means the clause is legally void, he agreed. Which means my north pasture is in no danger. No danger whatsoever. They looked at each other across the space of the land office, across the scarred oak desk and the nervous clerk and the contract that had been designed to steal something important from her. And Edna Atwood did something she very rarely did. She let a man see, for just a moment, past the composed surface of her. I thought you had done it, she said quietly. I was standing here and I thought you had built this trap for me and she stopped. She pressed her lips together. I know, he said. The roughness in his voice was something she had never heard from him before. I know what you thought. I should not have without all the information. You read a contract that had my name on it and found a clause that would have stolen your land and handed it to me, he said. You had every reason to think what you thought. You would have been a fool not to. I am never a fool, she said reflexively, and the corner of his mouth moved, just barely, not quite a smile, something more private than that. No, he said. You are certainly never that. They rode out to the north pasture that afternoon without discussing whether they would. It simply happened the way things between them often simply happen, not by decision exactly, but by the same gravitational logic that had been pulling them together since April, that she had been resisting with all her considerable intellect, and he had been resisting with all his considerable stubbornness, and that neither of them had been fully winning. The October light was amber and long, pouring across the grass at the low angle that made the north pasture look exactly as Edna had first seen it, like something out of a painting that no painter had yet been brave enough to attempt. The cottonwood trees along the ridge had gone golden, and the leaves fell in slow spirals in the still air, and the river beyond caught the light and threw it back in pieces. They sat on horseback side by side at the fence line and looked at it. Tell me about Greer, Edna said. Patrick told her. He had met Roland Greer at the saloon in late July. Greer had come with a proposal, not a purchase offer but something more sophisticated. A partnership, he had called it. A coordinated acquisition of mineral rights options across several valley properties, with Greer providing the capital and legal preparation and Patrick providing the land commission access and the local knowledge. Patrick had listened. He had let Greer explain the entire scheme before he told him no. He had told him no not because the money was bad. The money had been very good, but because he had grown up on this land and he was not interested in selling it, piece by piece and mineral right by mineral right, to a speculator from Denver who would strip it and move on. Greer had not argued. He had simply nodded, paid for his drink, and left. What Patrick had not realized, what he had apparently been too slow to understand, and the admission cost him something she could see in the set of his jaw, was that Greer had not come to Patrick seeking a partner. Greer had come to Patrick seeking information. Everything he needed had been in the commission-approved contract sitting on the land office desk, and a man with Roland Greer's particular talents had been able to read everything else he needed in the quiet and deliberate refusal of a man who knew his valley and his neighbors' habits very well indeed. "He used what you knew about me," Edna said. "Yes. My teaching schedule, my plans for winter travel, the boundary details. Yes." His jaw was very tight. "I am sorry. You did not choose this," she said. "I was careless," he said, "with information that concerned you. That was my fault." He was looking straight ahead at the north pasture, at the golden cottonwoods and the slow river. "Your land was put at risk because I was careless, and I am sorry for it." Edna was quiet for a moment. The apology was clean and unqualified, and she received it the same way. "We need to file a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office," she said. "The fraudulent modification of a commission-approved contract is a criminal matter. If Greer can be located—" "I'll write to the marshal in Cheyenne tonight," Patrick said. "I'll draft the complaint letter. I have documentation of my refusal of his purchase offer. I kept his written correspondence." She paused. "You reviewed the commission approval. You may have kept a copy." "I have copies of everything," he said. "Then we have sufficient evidence." She felt him look at her sideways. "You kept his correspondence." "I keep everything," she said. "People imagine that a schoolteacher's files contain only lesson plans and attendance records. They are wrong." This time the corner of his mouth moved all the way into an actual, genuine, unhidden smile, and Edna felt the warmth of it with an intensity that alarmed her considerably. They rode back toward town in the failing light, and Patrick said, without looking at her, "I would like to help you prepare the land for winter, if you'll allow it." "I am capable of preparing it myself," she said. "I know you are," he said, without a flicker of doubt or qualification. "I am asking if you will allow me to help." She considered this for a long moment. The horses walked steadily on the road between the fence lines, their breath coming visible in the cooling air, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge. "Yes," she said, "I will allow it." November was cold and clear and very beautiful in the Wyoming Valley, and in the weeks that followed, something between Edna Atwood and Patrick Turner changed in a way that was invisible and irrevocable and completely impossible to stop. They worked side by side most mornings and all day on Saturdays, her teaching through the week and riding out on her own horse now, a steady bay mare she had purchased in October and named Reason, while Patrick came from the Turner ranch with his hands and his tools and his unhurried competence, and together they winterized the homestead, insulated the new building's walls with straw and clay, stacked the woodpile, checked the fence lines, dug and covered the root cellar. He was extraordinary to watch. She did not tell him this, but she watched. The economy of his movements, the way he never wasted effort, the way he handled the men who worked for him, with authority that was entirely without cruelty, matter of fact and fair. He was 20 years into the business of surviving in this country, and it showed in every movement he made. And watching him was like reading a very good book in which every word was precisely the right word, and none of them were there for decoration. And he watched her too. She knew this with the same certainty with which she knew the angles of the survey maps, because she paid attention to everything and Patrick Turner paid attention to her. He had a way of turning slightly when she spoke, orienting toward her voice with a completeness that she had to force herself not to respond to, and a way of listening that was rarer than any physical beauty absolute, and without the restlessness that most people brought to listening, the waiting for their turn to speak. On a Thursday morning in the second week of November, 3 of Patrick's hands were down sick with a winter cold, and he came to the homestead alone to finish nailing down the roof shingles on the outbuilding. He was up on the roof by the time Edna arrived in the afternoon, having dismissed school early because 2 of her own students had the same cold, and she stood at the base of the ladder and looked up at him and said, "The 3rd row from the south edge is misaligned." He looked down at her. "What? 3rd row? It's off by approximately half an inch to the east. If it catches wind like that, it will lever up over winter." He looked at the row. He looked back at her. He came down the ladder, walked around the building, climbed up on the other side to see the row from a different angle, and she watched the moment he saw it, the slight adjustment in his posture that meant he had confirmed something he hadn't wanted to confirm. He came back down. "How did you see that from the ground?" he said. "The shadow line," she said. "When the sun hits the shingles at this angle, the shadow of the upper course falls slightly off from where it should if the alignment is true. The third row throws a shadow that is half a thumb's width too far east." He stared at her, not in the baffled way that men sometimes stared at her when she said things they had not expected. In a different way entirely, something behind his eyes that she could not quite categorize, and that made her feel very warm and very exposed simultaneously. "I have been roofing buildings for 20 years, he said. "I know," she said. "I have never," he stopped. "How do you know that?" "I observe things," she said simply. "I always have. My father said it was my greatest gift and my most inconvenient quality." Patrick was quiet for a moment. The sun was moving through the late afternoon sky, pouring its long amber light across the roof and the yard and the gold-leafed cottonwoods at the ridge, and the wind had gentled to almost nothing. He was looking at her with an expression that she was only now beginning to understand, beginning to allow herself to translate, because she had been refusing to translate it for months, because the translation led somewhere that her careful and defended self was not sure she was prepared to go. "Edna," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "Patrick," she said, and the word in her own voice surprised her how naturally it came, how right it sat in the air between them. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, which she noted intellectually was faster than she had anticipated, and then he stopped, close enough that she could see the particular dark gold of his beard and the way the cold had put color in his face along the hard line of his cheekbones, and he said, very quietly, "I think I have been in serious trouble since April." "Since April," she said carefully. "Since you were standing in the north pasture in your work boots telling me I was on Atwood land," he said. "And you were right. You were standing on your own land and you were right about everything, right from the beginning." "I usually am," she said, and she heard the tremble that had gotten into her voice and was furious with it. "I know," he said. "That's Edna, that is the thing, that is the actual thing. You are the most," he stopped, tried again. "I have never met anyone like you. I have never met anyone who sees the way you see, who understands the way you understand, who stands her ground the way you stand yours." And he stopped again, and she saw, with a shock that went all the way through her, that Patrick Turner, who was always sure of everything, was not sure of this. He was standing in front of her with all his considerable strength and none of his usual certainty, and there was something entirely unguarded in his face. "I don't know what to do with it." "With what?" she said. "With how much I admire you," he said. "With how much I think about you. With Patrick," she said, and her voice was very quiet and steady now, steadier than she felt, which was a miracle of sorts. "I have been thinking about you since April too." He looked at her. "I have been resisting it," she said. "I am very good at resisting things, but I have not been entirely successful." "No," he said. "No," she said. He reached out slowly and touched her face, one hand, the rough calloused back of his knuckle against her cold cheek, and she did not move away from it. "May I?" he began. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. It was brief and careful and nothing like she might have imagined if she had allowed herself to imagine it, which she had not. She had been extremely disciplined about not imagining it, and it was better than anything she had not imagined because it was real. His mouth was warm against the cold air, and his hand was gentle against her face, and when he pulled back she had to remind herself to breathe. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. They stood there in the gold afternoon light beside the half-roofed outbuilding with the misaligned shingles, and Edna Atwood felt something open in her chest that she had kept shut for a very long time, and she was terrified and clear-eyed and certain all at once, in the way she was certain about the things that were most true. She went back to teaching school. He finished the roof, the third row corrected. They had dinner at the hotel dining room in town on a Friday evening, which was a public declaration that Sweetwater absorbed with the practiced attention of a community that had been waiting for something interesting to happen. They were talked about, naturally. Edna ignored the talk with a serenity that was entirely genuine. Patrick ignored it with slightly more effort. They had dinner again the following Friday, and the one after that. He told her about his wife, Clara, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch of the homestead after a day of working the fence line, and the telling was quiet and careful and not without pain, but it was honest, and Edna received it without the false comfort that she had always found impossible to deliver. She simply listened, and at the end she said, "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," he said. "She was kind in a way that I didn't have much of that growing up. My father was a hard man. Clara was soft without being weak. That is a rarer thing than people think." "Yes," Edna said, "it is. You are not soft," he said, and it was not an unkindness. He said it the way he said everything true as a statement of fact observed and accepted. "You are something else entirely." "I have had to be," she said simply. She told him in return about growing up in Cheyenne with Josiah Atwood, who had given her books instead of dolls and debates instead of dance lessons, and had treated her intelligence as the thing most worth developing in her, and who had died in the spring of 1880, one of a fever that had taken him in 4 days, and left her with a deed to a quarter section of Wyoming grassland, and the specific, painful, galvanizing grief of losing the only person who had ever fully understood her. "Until you," she said, and then stopped, because she had not intended to say that. Patrick looked at her in the evening dark. "Until me," he said quietly, "December came." The letter arrived from the Cheyenne Marshal's office in the second week of the month, confirming that Roland Greer had been located in Laramie and was being held on fraud charges relating to multiple land scheme complaints filed across Wyoming territory. The Sweetwater complaint, written in Edna's precise and devastating legal prose, was listed as the primary evidence. The fraudulent subclause in the contract was formally voided by the Territorial Land Office. Edna's north pasture was unambiguously, permanently, and legally hers. She read the letter at the kitchen table of the homestead. She was sleeping there now on the weekends, getting the building ready for proper habitation, and felt a satisfaction so deep and clean it was almost physical. She also felt Patrick Turner come up behind her, because she heard his boots on the floor and felt the warmth of him close before he read over her shoulder, and she leaned back just slightly, just the fraction of an inch that was permission, and felt his hand come to rest on her shoulder, steady and warm. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. He left his hand there, and she let him leave it there, and the winter wind moved around the walls of the small house, and the fire in the stove put out its warmth, and the letter on the table said everything it needed to say, and then they did not talk about Roland Greer or the contract or the trap anymore. Christmas in Sweetwater was marked by a church service and a communal dinner in the meeting hall, and Patrick Turner attended with Edna Atwood on his arm, which was not exactly a surprise to anyone at this point, but which still produced a collective warmth in the room that was genuine and kind. Mrs. Harriet Caldwell, who was 72 years old and the closest thing Sweetwater had to a formal historian, pressed Edna's hands between both of hers and said, "You are exactly what this valley needed, dear, and I hope you know it." Edna, who had spent her adult life being necessary in ways that did not include people telling her so, found that this made her throat very tight. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "And you," Mrs. Caldwell said, releasing Edna's hands to pin Patrick with a look that had survived 7 decades entirely undiminished, "have been alone long enough. Do not be foolish about it." "No, ma'am," Patrick said, with a gravity that was mostly genuine. He proposed to her in the north pasture on a day in January when the snow lay clean and white across the grass and the cottonwood trees stood bare and silver against the blue sky, and the river ran dark and quick between its white banks. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He said what was true in the way he always said what was true directly, without ornamentation, with the full weight of meaning behind it. He said, "I want to marry you, Edna." I want to build a life with you on this land, your land and mine both, and I want to grow old next to the most remarkable person I have ever known. That is what I want, if you will have me." Edna stood in the snow in the north pasture where she had stood in the spring grass 8 months ago, when it had all begun, and she looked at this man who had confused her and impressed her, and at one dark moment she had believed had betrayed her, and who had in the months since proved himself to be someone she did not have to perform certainty for, someone who liked her certainty and matched it with his own, someone who understood what it meant to love a piece of ground the way she understood it. Someone who did not ask her to be less. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He kissed her with more enthusiasm than he had kissed her the first time, which she appreciated, and the snow was cold under her boots, and the sky was enormous above them, and she thought that her father, who had been a romantic in addition to a schoolteacher, would have been very pleased. They were married in February, in the Sweetwater church on a Saturday that was cold and clear and very bright, with the snow reflecting the light off every surface so that the whole town looked like it had been cut from silver. Edna wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from Cheyenne, and that fit her as precisely as she intended everything to fit, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had pressed the previous summer from the meadow behind the homestead. Patrick wore his good suit, dark, well cut, and stood at the front of the church with an expression that was not the composed certainty she had come to expect from him, but something entirely different, something unguarded and luminous, and she walked toward it with a steadiness that cost her nothing, because for the first time in a very long time she was walking toward something she had chosen with her whole self, not just the parts of herself that were sensible and careful and defended. Esteban and Carr were in the pews, along with Patrick's ranch hands and the families of her students and Mrs. Caldwell in the front row looking entirely satisfied with the state of things, and Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony with a warmth that was the genuine article, and when Patrick took her hand, it was with the same firm and careful grip that had introduced them in the north pasture 10 months ago, except that now it held on. They lived in the homestead on the Atwood quarter section. Edna had been insistent about this. In the gentle but completely immovable way she was insistent about things. And Patrick kept the Turner Ranch as well, the two properties now managed as adjacent operations with a single household at their center. It was an unusual arrangement by the standards of the time, and Sweetwater discussed it with interest for about 3 weeks before the novelty wore off, because people generally came around to the logic of Edna Atwood's decisions eventually, even when they required a moment of adjustment. She continued to teach school at the schoolhouse on Birch Creek Road. Patrick, who had expected nothing else and would not have suggested otherwise, rode her there on winter mornings when the roads were bad and picked her up in the afternoons when the days were short. And in spring and fall, she rode Reason herself and came home with her hair loose from the wind and her eyes bright from the cold. And every time he saw her come over the ridge, he felt the same thing he had felt in January in the north pasture. That particular quality of rightness that did not come from ease but from something deeper, the recognition of a match. Spring came again to the Wyoming Valley. The grassland greened, the river rose with the snowmelt, the cottonwoods along the ridge put out their first pale leaves. Edna's north pasture came back to life in the way it had been coming back to life for 10,000 springs, indifferent to contracts and fraud and the small machinations of men, and now with a house on it that was warm and full and smelled of wood smoke, and the particular lemon verbena soap that Edna had always used and that Patrick had decided was the best smell in the world. In March, Edna wrote a formal report to the Wyoming Territorial Education Board documenting the mathematics curriculum she had developed for the Sweetwater School, which incorporated practical land, survey principles, and basic contract literacy. The reading of legal documents into the standard curriculum for older students. She submitted it with a covering letter explaining that frontier children, and specifically frontier girls, needed to understand the language of legal agreements, because that language would govern their lives and their property in ways for which no one was currently preparing them. The board, after a period of silence that suggested some internal debate, approved the curriculum expansion. It was, several board members noted privately to each other, the most clearly argued education proposal they had received in years. Edna read the approval letter at the kitchen table and smiled the small, private smile that was her truest one. Patrick, who had come in from checking the east fence, read it over her shoulder the same way he had read the marshal's letter in December, his hand warm on her shoulder. "Well done," he said. "It is only a beginning," she said. "There is considerably more to be done." "There usually is with you," he said. "Is that a complaint?" "It is the opposite of a complaint," he said. She tilted her head back and looked up at him, and what passed between them in that moment was what always passed between them: acknowledgement without apology, seeing without performance, the particular freedom of being known by someone who has chosen to know you and to go on choosing it. He kissed her forehead and went back outside, and she returned to the letter, and the spring light moved across the kitchen table, and the homestead was full of the ordinary sounds of a life being lived. In late April, Edna realized with a combination of mathematical certainty and considerable surprise that she was expecting a child. She told Patrick on a Thursday evening by simply looking at him across the dinner table and saying, "I believe you are going to be a father." He had been motionless for a moment, in the way that large still things go motionless before they are moved, and then he had stood up from the table and come around to her and put his arms around her, very carefully, and she had felt against her temple the rough warmth of his jaw and the particular ragged quality of his breath that meant he was feeling something he had not yet found words for. "Are you well?" he said, against her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am excellent, in fact. Do not treat me as though I have suddenly become fragile." He laughed, which was not something he did often enough, and she felt the laugh more than she heard it, because his chest was pressed against her shoulder. "I would not dream of it," he said. The pregnancy in its early months was unremarkable, which Edna was grateful for in a practical sense and occasionally embarrassed by in an intellectual sense, because she had always felt that remarkable things should merit more attention. She continued teaching school through the summer and into the fall, with the assistance of a student teacher she had trained, a clever 15-year-old girl named Agnes Hollies, whose capacity for mathematics Edna had identified in the girl's first week in the classroom, and cultivated with a focused intensity that Agnes's parents found both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. She also, in her 7th month, completed and filed the formal complaint documentation against Roland Greer that the Cheyenne Marshal's office had requested for the trial proceedings. The documentation was 42 pages long, precisely organized, and referenced 8 separate precedents in Wyoming territorial law. The prosecuting attorney wrote her back a letter that was nearly reverent in its admiration. Patrick found this letter on the desk and read it, and experienced the emotion that had become familiar to him. The deep, bottomless impression of a woman whose capacities he had already thought he understood, and who continued to exceed those understandings. He went and found her in the schoolroom where she was grading papers and said, "The attorney in Cheyenne is apparently in awe of you." "He should not be," she said without looking up. "The law is not complicated. People simply do not read it carefully enough." "Edna," he said. She looked up. "You are extraordinary," he said. She gave him the small private smile, the true one. "I know," she said. "Thank you for noticing." In November of 1883, on a Tuesday afternoon when the cottonwoods had again gone gold, Edna delivered a son. He came into the world with the Turner jaw and the Atwood eyes, and a degree of opinion about the proceedings that the doctor said was the most vocal infant he had delivered in 30 years of practice. Patrick sat beside the bed in the lamplight and held him the way he held everything important, with a careful strength that understood its own power, and the expression on his face was one that Edna committed entirely to memory, because it was the most open and undefended she had ever seen him. "What shall we call him?" Patrick asked. "Josiah," Edna said. Her voice was steady and a little rough, and she meant every syllable of it. He looked at her over the baby's head. "After your father." "Yes, Josiah Turner," he said, trying it. "Josiah Patrick Turner," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a great deal of name for someone this small." "He'll grow into it," Edna said. He smiled. The real one, the full one that she had been slowly and patiently and persistently excavating from all that reserve since April of last year. "Yes," he said. "He will." Little Josiah Patrick Turner grew with the particular aggressive velocity of frontier children, who seemed to understand early that the land they were growing up on did not make allowances for slowness. He had his father's physical confidence and his mother's relentless curiosity, which was a combination that kept both of his parents fully occupied, and that Mrs. Caldwell, who lived to see him walk, described as entirely fitting. Edna taught school for 3 more years after Josiah's birth, then stepped back from the schoolroom to take a position on the county education board, where she could do considerably more damage to the structures she objected to than she could do from the classroom. Agnes Hollies, now 19 and fully trained, took over the Sweetwater school with a competence that Edna had ensured and a dedication that was entirely her own. Patrick expanded the ranch operations in the spring of 1884, adding a breeding program for horses, a change from his father's purely cattle focus, that Edna had suggested in one of their evening conversations on the basis of what she had observed about the local market and the territorial military contracts. She had laid out the economic argument on 4 pages of careful arithmetic, placed it on the desk, and gone to bed. He had stayed up until midnight reading it and come to bed saying nothing, and in the morning he had said, "You are right about the horses." "I am usually right," she said. "Remarkably often," he agreed. By the summer of 1885, the Turner Ranch breeding program was supplying horses to 3 military outposts and had become the most profitable single operation Patrick ran. He told Edna this on an evening when they were sitting on the porch watching Josiah, now 18 months old and already attempting to climb the fence post, with the sun going down behind the western ridge in a blaze of orange and rose. "I know," she said. "I did not say anything to you about the finances," he said. "How do you know?" "I do the accounts," she said. "I do the accounts," he said. "We both do the accounts," she said, "and we arrive at the same numbers, which is reassuring. I review the weekly supply figures as well, and I can see you review the supply figures." "Someone has to." She said it without apology. He looked at her. Then he looked at Josiah, who had successfully achieved the second fence rail and was looking extremely pleased with himself. Then Patrick looked at his hands, at the hard work that was written in every line of them, and at the valley spread out before them in the evening light, the land that was theirs, her north pasture and his east range and the river running between them, and he felt the fullness of it with an intensity that, for a man of his self-contained nature, was entirely new. This life. This particular, improbable, specific life that had begun with a woman standing in a pasture telling him what land belonged to her, and that had been built, day by day and argument by argument and discovery by discovery, into something he had not known how to want before she taught him how. "Edna," he said. She glanced at him. "Yes." "Thank you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "For what specifically?" "For finding the clause," he said. "For not assuming it was me without hearing the answer, for staying." "I am not the staying type unless I want to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I am grateful." She reached over and took his hand on the armrest between the 2 chairs, her fingers wrapping around his in the easy, unhurried way that was one of the small revolutions of her life. That a touch could be easy, that closeness did not have to be earned against resistance, that another person's hand in hers was not a complication, but a fact as simple as the river running north. "I wanted to stay," she said. Josiah fell off the fence rail and sat down hard in the dirt and considered the situation for a moment before deciding, in the Turner way, that this did not merit tears, and got back up and tried again. In the spring of 1886, Edna discovered she was expecting a second child, which she announced at dinner with the same matter-of-fact precision that characterized all her announcements. Patrick had by this point developed a system for receiving such information, which was to set his fork down, look at her for 3 full seconds, and then smile the real smile, which Edna had decided privately was one of the finest things she had ever had occasion to see on a regular basis. She delivered a girl in December of 1886, during a snowstorm that kept the doctor at the Turner homestead for 2 days, which he found dramatically inconvenient, and which Edna found merely logistically complicated. The girl arrived with a head of dark hair and enormous eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw that was identifiable from the first moment as being entirely her mother's. "Clara," Edna said when Patrick asked. He looked at her with those green eyes that missed nothing. "Are you certain?" "She deserves a name that means something," Edna said simply. "And your Clara was a remarkable woman, as you told me. Soft without being weak, you said. I believe in those qualities. I want our daughter to know her name carries them." Patrick was quiet for a long moment. Josiah, 2 years old and full of opinions, was asleep in the next room, and the snow was still coming down outside the window, and the fire in the stove made the room amber and warm. He bent over the bed and kissed Edna's forehead, slowly and with great care, the way he did the things that mattered most. "Clara Turner," he said. "Yes." The Sweetwater years settled into their proper shape after that. The shape of a life built by 2 people who had each come to the valley carrying their own separate gravity, and had gradually, stubbornly, and without fully intending it, become something that orbited together. The Roland Grier trial concluded in the spring of 1886 in Cheyenne, with Grier convicted on 3 counts of land fraud and sentenced to 4 years in the territorial prison. Edna received the verdict notice by telegraph and read it at the kitchen table, and then placed it in her files. Between the copy of the original contract and the corrective notation she had made to the survey map on a hitching post in May of 1882, and felt that particular deep satisfaction of a thing fully resolved. The County Education Board, under Edna's determined influence, formally adopted the contract literacy curriculum for all schools in the county by the fall of 1886. It was the first time such a curriculum had been formally implemented in Wyoming territory, and it received a brief mention in the Cheyenne newspaper under the heading Local Innovation in Frontier Education, which Edna read and found adequately accurate if slightly less precise than she would have written it herself. Patrick read it and said, "They misspelled your name." "They did," she said. "I have already written to correct them." "Of course you have," he said. Little Josiah, at 3, had decided that horses were the purpose of existence, which was a development that Patrick regarded with tremendous quiet satisfaction, and Edna regarded with calm practicality, having already determined that the child had the physical coordination and the focused temperament to be very good at it. Clara, at 6 months, was expressing a preliminary interest in everything that moved or made noise, which Edna took as an encouraging sign of general intelligence. On a Sunday evening in May of 1887, 5 years after the spring morning when Edna had stood in the north pasture in her work boots and told Patrick Turner that he was on Atwood land, they were sitting on the porch of the homestead in the warm late light, watching Josiah march importantly through the yard with a stick that served as his horse, and Clara asleep in the cradle that Patrick had built from cottonwood wood during the winter, and that Edna had lined with blue calico. The north pasture lay golden in the evening light. The river ran beyond it, catching the last of the sun. The cottonwood trees at the ridge were green now, fully leafed, and the valley spread away in every direction with the kind of quiet beauty that never required anyone to say anything about it. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," Patrick said, "if you hadn't read Subclause C?" Edna considered this. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes I would have traveled to Cheyenne in November. I would have returned in January and found that I had lost the north pasture. I would have filed a formal contest. I had the original deed, the claim was solid, and it would have gone to territorial court. I believe I would have one eventually. But eventually is not immediately, she said. It would have cost money and time and considerable effort that I did not have in abundance, and it would have been ugly. She was quiet for a moment. But the land would have been mine in the end. You're certain of that? I'm certain of most things I set my mind to, she said. He smiled. And if the contract trap had worked, it would not have worked, she said. You found it in 3 minutes. 2.5, she said. He looked at her. I was there, Edna. You had the contract for 3 minutes before you found it. I had it for 2.5. You were watching the wall when I first started reading. She tilted her head slightly. I noticed. He laughed, the real laugh, the one she never tired of. 2.5 minutes, he said. 2.5 minutes to find a clause that a land attorney would have missed, because you read everything. Because I was taught to read everything, she said, by a man who believed that words were the most powerful things in the world and that the only defense against someone using them against you was to understand them better than they did. Your father, Patrick said. My father, she said. They sat with this for a moment, in the companionable quiet that had become one of the things she valued most about being with him. The ability to be quiet together without anyone feeling the pressure to fill the space, because they had both filled enough space in their lives with the necessary noise of survival, and were now in a position to choose silence when silence was the right thing. Josiah completed a circuit of the yard, returned to the porch, and announced with 3-year-old authority that he was going to be a horse rancher when he was big. A horse rancher, Patrick said seriously. That is a fine profession. The best, Josiah agreed. You could also be a teacher, Edna said. Josiah considered this. Could I do both? Your mother does both, Patrick said, so yes. Your father does both, Edna corrected. He runs a ranch and he sat on the county commission for 3 years. You both do everything, Josiah decided, which was a fairly accurate summary, and went back to his circuit of the yard. Clara stirred in the cradle and made a small considering sound, and Edna reached over and set the cradle gently rocking, and the evening settled itself around the homestead, around the north pasture and the river and the cottonwood ridge, around the life that had been built here from a land deed and a hidden trap and a schoolteacher who read everything and a rancher who had the grace to be surprised by her and the wisdom to love her for it. Patrick looked at her profile in the evening light, the decisive jaw and the dark eyes and the particular quality of stillness she had when she was at peace, which was different from the stillness she had when she was thinking, and he had learned to read the difference, had spent 3 years learning the entire language of her, and felt the same thing he always felt, which had not diminished with time and which he now understood would not, because it was not the kind of feeling that diminished. It was the kind that deepened. Edna, he said, she said, still watching Josiah. I love you, he said. She turned and looked at him, the small private smile, the true one. I know, she said. I love you as well. You could occasionally say it without the as well, he said. I could, she agreed. But that is how it sounds when I mean it. He reached over and covered her hand with his on the armrest, and she turned her hand over and clasped his, and they sat like that in the May evening with the children and the valley and the life spread around them, and the north pasture glowed in the last of the light, solid and certain and entirely hers, and the river ran on between its banks the way rivers do, not stopped by fraud or seasons or the passage of time, just running, clean and persistent, carrying everything with it and arriving somewhere new. The trap had been built to take something from her. That was what traps were for. But a trap requires a person who does not see it coming, and Edna Atwood had been seeing things coming since she was old enough to read a contract, a survey map, a lesson plan, or a man's face in the afternoon light. The trap had been found in 2.5 minutes, and it had done the opposite of what it was designed to do. It had been the thing that brought her to that land office with Patrick Turner on a November afternoon, had been the thing that shook loose the pretense between them, had forced the reckoning that neither of them had been brave enough to force on their own. Roland Greer, sitting in the territorial prison in Cheyenne, would never know that his carefully constructed betrayal had achieved exactly nothing except to give a schoolteacher and a rancher the particular confrontation they had needed, and to become, in the end, the first page of a story that was very different from the one he had written it for. Edna thought about this sometimes, with the mathematical pleasure of elegant outcomes. The way a problem, when solved correctly, resolved not just the immediate question but several adjacent ones simultaneously. She thought about it on this May evening, with Patrick's hand in hers and her children in the yard and the cradle, and the valley coming alive in the last light. The north pasture was exactly where it had always been. She was exactly where she had decided to be. And that, in the end, was the only thing about it that needed to be said.